Good morning. Welcome to week 7. This week we're looking at motivation, which is a hugely important topic for school. You may think that as a teacher it's your job to motivate your students to learn, but right at the outset I'm just going to tell you that actually the only person that can motivate somebody to do something is themselves. So as a teacher, as an educator, it is not your job to motivate students to learn. What your job is to do is to create the conditions in which students are able to motivate themselves to learn. And so although there's a lot of talk about motivating students, you can't directly motivate anybody, we can't really know what motivates people other than ourselves. So, but we can test people and judge by their behaviour whether they're motivated, and create the conditions that we hope translate into motivation. So I'd first like to start off with a bit of confession. I struggle with procrastination. I am not a highly motivated, highly organised person, and deadlines are my motivation. So I tend to wait until the very last minute and then ride the adrenaline wave in order to finish really important tasks. So just from the outset, I'd just like to say, don't be like me, that hopefully you're intrinsically motivated, you want to do really well in this course, and that will motivate you to start early and get prepared early for your assignments. And you're not going to be like your course coordinator who tends to leave things to the last minute and pulls all-nighters and kind of ruins her weekend by not getting things done in good time. Also, I'm going to call myself out here because I'm one of those typical Gen X lecturers who just can't keep up with meme culture and puts old memes up. So I know that the "Don't Be Like Bob" meme is not new, but I'm not pretending to be hip and cool. I just like the meme and thought that I would use it anyway. Okay, so we're going to start with a recap of last week's lecture and then think about motivation and look at Sorry, there's somebody at my door and I'm just hoping that they don't walk in and I'll have to start this lecture again. Okay, so motivation is highly complex, and so we're going to look at 6 different theories that describe motivation in different ways, as behaviour, motives as goals, motives as interests, motives as attribution, and then look at motivation at being self-efficacy and self-determination. And then we're going to finish the lecture by looking at the target model, which is an integrated model of motivation for the classroom. And next week we'll go even in more depth around looking at integrated models and how that draw on educational psychology research and see how these models operate in schools. So what my goal with Module 3 is not to turn you into educational psychologists, because it would take me probably 3 or 4 years to do that. But what I'm trying to do instead is give you the tools as educators to draw from the field of educational psychology when you're planning your lessons, when you're trying to work out and get to know your students and how they learn. And so I'm giving you exposure to some of the key ideas in the field, and then through your assignment you're learning how to engage with and use educational psychology research. And then so next week we'll see how schools draw from the huge body of educational research and create programs that then they operationalize in their school. And so this week is kind of pretty theory heavy because there's just so many ways to understand motivation, and motivation being so complex that actually schools use all of these and teachers use all of these as part of their toolkits to create the conditions for their students to motivate themselves. And so it's going to be sort of heavy weather as we look at sort of the 6 dominant ways that motivation is understood, but things will be a bit more exciting next week, hopefully, when we look at how these are operationalized. Now, motivation being so complicated that just explaining the 6 dominant theories is probably a big enough task for me. So in terms of introduction to motivation, just watch the crash course motivation video on YouTube that I've supplied that goes with this lecture, and that sort of looks at motivation from a broader biological survival perspective. And then this video looks more specifically at 6 models that connect motivation to learning. So the the crash course psychology video, which is I think pretty entertaining, looks at motivation in terms of survival instinct. And then now I'm drilling down a bit more deeply into the theories of motivation that really connect to schooling and learning. I also should say that last week's lecture, and I thank you for your patience because I wasn't actually available last week to make a lecture. I spent a good part of my weekend in the emergency department with my son, who fortunately is fine, but it did take away the time that I usually have to prepare. So the problem with being a procrastinator is when things go wrong, you haven't got much wiggle room. So I thank you for putting up with a curated set of lectures rather than listening to my dulcet tones. So last week's lecture looked at social emotional learning, and we started with a video that explained a neuroscience perspective that looked at what's going on in your memory when you're feeling particular emotions, and to show that well-being and positive emotions help you learn because what you learn is more easily remembered when you're in a healthy psychological state than when you're feeling stress or anxiety. So there's a biological connection between positive feelings of social and emotional well-being and learning and memory. And so that lecture sort of gave that overview from the perspective of a neuroscientist. And that's the research that underpins a lot of the programs that run in schools, but they often don't reference the work that neuroscience are doing at the moment, but that's where those ideas come from, and this renewed understanding of the importance of social emotional well-being and its connection to learning. And so the second video that I put up for you showed sort of the five of the dominant traits that are understood as being helping students cultivate positive socio-emotional state that will help them learn. And that's not the definitive definition and the definitive way of thinking about socio-emotional learning, but it's one of the kind of dominant frameworks that are going around at the moment. And then the third video looked at a particular program that's marketing itself for use by schools. So it's not the only way to embed socio-emotional learning in schools, but it's one that's doing the rounds at the moment and that many schools in Australia are using. So putting together those three videos sort of gives an overview of why concentration and awareness on socio-emotional learning is important, and then one of the models for how it's understood, and then how it's actualized and used as a school program. So similarly, this week we'll look at 6 theories around motivation, and then an integrated model for how schools use motivation and target motivation in the classroom. So one of the oldest theories sees motivation as a form of behaviour. So we can't measure someone's motivation, but we certainly can measure and observe their behaviour. And this is influenced by the work of Skinner, and it forms the basis of a particular learning theory called behaviourism, that if we can get people to behave in certain ways, then we can get them to learn. And so there's various forms of conditioning that either through rewards and punishments that we can get students to do things. So the classic example of behaviourism is the example of Pavlov's dog, by which a dog was conditioned to associate the sound of a bell with food, and then that would trigger a salivation response. So prior to conditioning, if you showed a dog food, you'd get salivation response. If you ring a bell, you get no response because there's nothing intrinsically connected with food from the sound of a bell. However, you can condition the dogs to respond to the bell by presenting the bell, ringing the bell at the same time as the food's presented, and then the dog starts salivating, and then the sound of the bell becomes associated with the food to the point where after conditioning is finished, you can ring the bell and trigger a salivation response even when there's no food present. And so this idea that you could train people with sort of unrelated stimuli to respond to them became the basis of this whole field of behaviourism, which both underpins learning theory and motivation theory. And some of it's around avoiding negative consequences, and some of it's around getting students to vie for rewards within the classroom. And it's the sort of pure form of behaviourism isn't as dominant in schools in the moment. So we're not using physical punishment, for example. We're not trying to get students to avoid the cane because we no longer use corporal punishment in schools. But there is still kind of traces of this this particular theory that's present in classrooms. So we see the influence of behaviourism in things like training students to associate particular outcomes with positive rewards. So grades in themselves are actually a form of feedback, but we're trying to get students to strive for positive grades and to associate with positive grades. Reward charts are another form of behaviourism, and so there's nothing intrinsically connected between getting a sticker and putting your hand up and using your manners and the other behaviours that teachers want to see more of, but by connecting the positive sticker with those behaviours, we're hoping to cultivate more of those positive behaviours in our students. And schools have become more sophisticated in their use of reward charts and built programs such as Class Dojo, which is an app that teachers, parents and students can use, whereby instead of a sticker chart, the students have avatars and they're rewarded publicly displayed or in their own app for positive behaviour. There's also you can lose some of your rewards and your stickers and your points and your trophies for negative behaviour. So Class Dojo is probably one of the most popular behavioural apps on the market at the moment. It's used in over 70 countries around the world. There's 2 million schools using it. And there's a lot of critiques of it because it's an untested psychological experiment that's taking place on a massive scale. And so we've got this combination of heavy-handed psychological approach to behavioural control that's being pushed out using modern technology, and digital technologies in the classroom, but without any testing on the long-term implications of these rewards and control that's present when these particular tools are used. Class Dojo has a lot of fans. Because parents can see how well their students are behaving and have access to what rewards or negative consequences their children have access to. And Class Dojo markets itself as a handy management tool and a messaging tool that helps recognise and reward students. But it's also a tool of negative consequences as well. And it's become more and more sophisticated. Now it's not just about rewarding positive behaviours, but there's also a new push for socio-emotional learning and embedding growth mindset training in Class Dojo, and that's something that I will discuss more next week. So we have, with the example of Class Dojo, an example of a particularly old motivation theory being combined with up-to-date modern technologies that allow sort of instantaneous reward and public display of reward, and then students seeing where other students are at and kind of measuring their behaviour accordingly. Now, part of the issue with something like Class Dojo is that we're taking a very small slice of human behaviour and pathologizing things that sit outside that slice and rewarding and normalizing the things in there that we can measure. So we're not allowing students the full range of emotional responses or classroom behaviour, and we're managing for a particular normal behaviour, and we've replaced sort of corporeal punishment or corporal punishment that used to take place in schools with kind of these sophisticated techniques of psychological persuasion. Now, I've probably rabbited on about Class Dojo for long enough. Suffice to say, there's more research needs to be done on combining of kind of social media type tools with classroom management. And so we can see that behaviourism is still present, even if it's not as unsophisticated as the old cane. Now, the second way of thinking about motivation is people's motives being expressed as goals. So there's several ways that this can be done. So some people are motivated by mastery. So they might want to learn all there is about a topic because they just want to have a really sophisticated understanding because they want to master that particular goal. So you might see this in music where someone wants to just nail playing that piece, whereas for somebody else they're motivated by a performance goal, and it's less about playing that piece as hitting the next level. And so there's a slight, even though they're both, you can see the motivation in both students. One is motivated by this determination to be the best because they want to know the particular musical piece, whereas the other one's motivated to demonstrate that they have more ability or more competence than others, or that they want to just show that they're moving through the musical levels. And so they are approach-orientated goals, and they are expressed as mastery or performance goals. We also have avoidance-orientated goals, where people are motivated to avoid seeming like they misunderstand a given task. So it's less about approaching the particular goal, and more about seeking not to make a fool of themselves. So they don't want to misunderstand in terms of the mastery goals, or they want to avoid appearing incompetent or stupid in the eyes of their peers and of their teacher. So it's not that they're particularly motivated by a particular task, it's more that they're avoiding losing status with their teacher or with their peers, or they're avoiding looking like they don't understand what's going on. So they will answer the question in class even though they're not particularly motivated or connected to the topic, but they're operating from this avoidance orientation rather than an approach orientation. And so part of understanding these people's motivation and their goals as being what motivates them, is understanding that this all takes place in a social environment, and that students value and need the relationships with their classmates and their teachers, and often they will get a great deal of positive support from their relationships. But the effects of these complex social relationships can at times work for academic achievement and against academic achievement. So for example, when we're thinking about avoidance-orientated students, sometimes they're motivated to avoid appearing that they are misunderstanding a given task, and they might use distraction rather than going along with the class and listening as a way of distracting from the fact that they are having trouble with their learning. So often it'll be the class clown who's avoiding scrutiny of their reading ability or their ability to understand a difficult concept, is kind of playing up so that we're distracted, that the teacher's distracted, their peers are distracted, and they're getting positively reinforced by their behaviour by entertaining the class. So that those social relationships can work against academic achievement, because rather than working towards academic goals, the students are working towards social goals and peer acceptance and amusing others as a way of kind of avoiding demonstrating the troubles that they might be having due to dyslexia, for example. And there's a whole host of learning challenges that students might have, which make them more avoidance orientated than approach orientated, for example. So another way of that motivation could be understood is as interests. So students' motives are interpreted as being their interests. And so in addition to holding different kinds of goals, which are consequent difference in academic motivation, students show obvious difference in the level of interest in the topic and the tasks of the classroom. So for example, in an art classroom, students might be interested in art, they might like art, or they might just like the particular activities that are being done, whether it's painting or drawing, rather than art per se. So it could be less about the subject and more about the particular tasks of the classroom. And so students' interests vary in how deeply and permanently these interests are located within the students. So we can, as teachers, we can generate situational interests for our students. So we know that not every student loves history, but we can create a hook at the beginning of the lecture, or sorry, the beginning of our classroom, our lesson, that temporarily generates students' interest in the particular activity. So we might do Unusual sight, smell, words can generate situational interests or an unusual and new classroom activity. And so teachers will use situational interests as a way of varying the lessons and trying to get students engaged. So they might do things like, okay, we're studying medieval society, so let's build a model of a castle. So creating a situation that generates students' interests, regardless of how they feel about the subject as a whole. Whereas personal interests are relatively permanent preferences of the student and are usually expressed in a variety of situations. So students who see themselves invested in a particular subject connect it to their personal interest, and then the onus is less on the teacher because that student's already engaged in their subject. But oftentimes that doesn't happen, so it's the teacher's role to create the situational interests to try and generate student motivation in the everyday lessons. And a third way, I think, hopefully I'm keeping track and keeping count of understanding motivation, is motivation as attribution. So how does a student attribute their success? Now, there's several ways of a student might unpack and consider how they might attribute their success or their failure. And one is the degree to which they have control over the situation. So where a student thinks that they have high levels of control, then they're more likely to be a high achiever in a particular subject. But where a student feels like it's out of their control, then, and this is the locus of control, so who's got control? Do I have control? Does the teacher have the control? And if I feel like I have control because I can study, I can control how much time I put towards a subject, then I'm seeing that control located with me. But students who are low achievers tend to put the locus of control as external to them. I don't have time, it's too hard, it's not my fault, it's out of my control. So where the control is attributed internally or externally will often reflect whether a student's a high achiever or a low achiever. And then the stability. So if a student consistently does well in a course, then or a particular lesson or a subject, they will see that stable outcome and perceive that they have a high ability within that subject. But a student who doesn't necessarily always achieve well will often doubt their own ability and attribute a good result to luck. Oh, I was just lucky. They just asked the right questions this time, but I'm not actually good at maths. It was just a good day. So that they're not seeing the stable result. And then there is the controllability over a situation. So where a student feels that they have high control over a particular situation, they're more likely to have confidence and high self-esteem in regards to that particular subject. Whereas low achievers see things as being outside of their control, and so therefore they're likely to have low self-confidence and see their results as being subject to chance, whether they're feeling lucky or unlucky, or that the teacher doesn't like them, or they're no good at maths, for example. Those are the types of attitudes you're likely to get by students who don't attribute their learning as something that they can control. Whereas students that see their learning, they attribute their learning and their success to something that they control, you tend to have this positive cycle of reinforcement, and for the low achievers, you're getting a negative cycle of reinforcement. So how motivated a child is to succeed in a particular subject is thought in this theory of attribution to come down to where they attribute the success. And if they attribute it to themselves, their hard work, their knowledge of the subject, then they're more likely to create a positive cycle where they're working well. If success is attributed to luck, and failure is attributed to the fact that there's no good at it, then you're likely to see a cycle of low achievement and disinterest, and that students are not motivated. And so it will help motivation and achievement if a student attributes academic successes and failures to factors that are internal and controllable, such as effort or a choice to learn particular learning strategies. Whereas if it's seen as being the success and failure are external and it's not controllable, then motivation and achievement tend not to be there. So I think this is the fifth one, perhaps. That working on, based on Albert Bandura's work, motivation is understood as self-efficacy, which similar to the attribution theory around sense of self and whether you think you can actually succeed. And so how your perceived self-efficacy, so the degree to which you think you can plan, execute and succeed at a particular task, is influenced by a variety of factors. So previous performance, previous achievements, vicarious learning. So if you see someone else succeed, then you're more likely to think that you can succeed. Social persuasion. So for teachers, that means generating a classroom where students are working together and you've got an atmosphere of encouragement. Emotional arousement. So are students engaged in the task? So a stimulating environment is more likely to help people feel that they can succeed in a task. And so then where students feel that they have self-efficacy, that yes, if I sit down and I read this and I study for the test, I'll do well, I understand it, then you're likely to see outcomes that reinforce success. So you'll see persistence, where a student feels that they have self-efficacy. You'll see improved performance over time, and you'll see kind of approach motivation rather than avoidance motivation. And the opposite of that, where students have low self-efficacy, is learned helplessness. So that's where students feel like why would I try, because it doesn't matter, I'm not going to do very well anyway. And so some of the symptoms in classrooms that you see where students have learned helplessness are low self-esteem, feelings of frustration, passivity, so they're not getting engaged because why bother, I can't learn anyway, a lack of effort and a giving up. And where this is dangerous is where it becomes a persistent pattern, and then these students tend to fall further and further behind. And particular learning challenges can make students feel this experience of learned helplessness. So students who are dyspraxic or dyslexic or have other learning challenges such as ADHD often experience these feelings. But so what teachers' job is to allow students to motivate themselves is to cultivate feelings of success, and it might be that success is measured on different increments to that of their peers. It's to celebrate the success that you might not be telling students things like you might struggle with reading and writing, but you learn better through, you're a social learner, and let's work on your verbal skills so that you can demonstrate to me by telling me what you've learnt rather than me making you write it down. So teachers have got to be aware of students' strengths and weaknesses and really help students play to their strengths instead of having them trapped in a cycle of learned helplessness. So particularly in the primary years, but also early high school, when students' sense of self as a learner is being developed, avoiding learned helplessness is extremely important for teachers, because once a student feels like, oh, maths is not for me, it can be really, really hard to shift those negative feelings, and then it's very hard to create conditions in which students can feel motivated. And so I think if my calculations are correct, we're up to our last model, which is motivation as self-determination. So this is an extension of self-efficacy theory, and it's based on the idea that everybody has a basic need for autonomy, for competence, and to relatedness to others, and that all of us want to have some feelings of autonomy. We all want to feel competent in some areas, and we all want to feel connected and belongingness with other people. So if we can create a classroom that allows students to feel like they've got some autonomy over their learning, that allows them some success so they feel competent, and that allows them to remain connected and feeling related with others, then we can generate conditions in which students will be motivated. And that then needs across these three factors need to be met as much as possible in order to create motivation. And so relatedness can be around allowing academic success to be something that allows other students to relate. So you can have situations where if people succeed, that they're mocked, that they're, called a nerd or whatever the kids are saying these days, that undermines people demonstrating their competence. And so that kind of social element of learning is just as important as allowing students some sort of autonomy and allowing them to demonstrate. So you want to create cultures of learning and not cultures of where the kind of the dominant thing is not on learning. So where the relatedness is around sport or other non-academic, you're trying to create a balance in how the students are related so that success is a badge of honour rather than a badge of dishonour. Okay, so we've had this massive rush through 6 different motivation theories that kind of pull different levers to try and get students to feel motivated in a classroom. And, thinking through each of them, you can see intrinsically that they all make sense. So it gets a bit complex because if it's self-efficacy, is it behaviour, is it attribute? So how can we make sense of these 6 different ways of understanding motivation? Well, Ames and Epstein have built a model, or this model's been adapted from the work of Ames and Epstein, and it's used in a lot of schools. It's a particular framework that puts these theories of motivation together. It's the target framework. So, and it supports mastery goals. So we want students to mastery goals is thought to be a better motivator than performance goals because to be a mastery learner means that you're intrinsically motivated and not motivated by external things like levels and performance, but rather that you really want to know something to the greatest extent possible. And so to try and support mastery goals, these 6 dimensions are considered: the task, the authority, recognition, grouping, evaluation, and time. And so the task is how the learning activities are designed and how the assignments are designed. So if you think about it, we can't give students tasks that are completely beyond their ability, or else there's no way they're going to feel motivated. It's just depressing to be, you couldn't give a 5-year-old a 1,000-word essay, but we could ask them to write a sentence and draw a picture. So we have a task that matches their ability. And then to support students in mastery goals, these tasks are going to be varied, they're going to be challenging but achievable, and they're going to have a purpose that supports students' learning. And so you can see in just that brief example how task will look very, very different in a primary school than it would in a Year 7 classroom or a Year 12 classroom. And so the types of tasks that we get students to do to motivate them are quite different. So in Year 12, we're depending on what subject students choose, they can have quite a huge degree of difficulty in the tasks. So there's a big challenge in doing a personal interest project for society and culture, or producing a major work in design and technology or art, for example. So there's massive degree of challenge and a really big sense of purpose in those tasks, whereas the tasks you might be designing for kindergarten or Year 7 look quite different, and the kind of mastery goals that you're supporting students are quite different. So you can see here in just that example of task how understanding developmental psychology helps you understand motivation, because you can have a sense of what students at different ages and stages are capable of and build your tasks accordingly. And so the second dimension of this model is authority, and that's allowing students to become an authority, giving them opportunities to develop a sense of personal control and independence. And that might be starting with the independence of knowing how to write your own name versus the independence of designing your entire research project for your personal interest project. So the authority students get is developmental, and giving students authority fosters active participation and a sense of ownership over their learning, and that's how mastery goals are supported. Recognition, and so this is the use of formal and informal incentives and praise to show the students that you're recognising their learning. So that initiatives might be as simple as a sticker chart for younger children, and yet by secondary school it's having a chat to the students and recognising what they've done and how much they've learnt in a particular term. And that focuses on individual progress and improvement, and allows students to race themselves, and this encourages mastery learning. Whereas performance, you're racing for those that are performance goal orientated, they're performing against the rest of the class. But this focus on individual progress and improvement is about self-development, self-learning. Grouping is the fourth dimension of the target model, and this is arrangements utilised in the classroom to allow students to master the course content. So if we think back to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where we scaffold students either through the activities and the learning design so that they are able to go further with the appropriate scaffolds than they would if left to their own devices. And often their peers can be scaffolding them. So group work is a way of providing a scaffold, because you'll have students that know different dimensions of the things that they're learning about. So it may be that, for example, a lot of schools now are using Minecraft in years 7, 8 and 9. And some students come to these tasks and they might have to design a Japanese house, because we're learning Japanese, and then describe their house using Japanese words. But first they've got to learn how to use Minecraft. Now, of course, when you get a class together, there will always be children who know how to use Minecraft. So all of a sudden, those children become the experts in the room. And so that allows them to feel mastery, and they're helping the way that they're helping people who may not have exposure to Minecraft before, allows those students to master that content rather than the teacher having to be the one. And it's helpful because often the students in the class know more about Minecraft than the teacher. So that sort of arrangement of group work and sharing expertise can help the students master the course content in a way that doesn't leave the teacher having to individually coach all of the students in the classroom. And so a mixture of individual and cooperative learning is the basis of supporting mastery goals in the grouping dimension of the target model. The fifth dimension is evaluation, and that's methods that are used to assess and monitor learning. And those methods can be formative, where the teacher is taking an informal summary and note of where the students are at in order to develop them further. So even just asking students what they know or understand or what they don't understand is a way of measuring students' learning. And then summative evaluation or assessment is the tasks that add up to a student's mark at the end of the particular unit or the year. So we tend to use lots of formative assessment the younger the students are, and then switch to more formal summative assessment as students are in older grades. And evaluation is about giving students the opportunities to improve their work, and we evaluate using a diverse array of models. So it's not just marks in a test that allow us to evaluate where our students are at. And then time, so giving students the appropriate workload and the appropriate pace of instruction, because there's no point getting all the rest of it right if we make a task go for too long and everyone's bored, or not long enough and no one can achieve it. And so we can allow our students to participate in the scheduling, and that also feeds back into evaluation. Do they need more time? Do they need less time? Do I need to change the task? So this target provides a framework for thinking about a way of supporting students developing mastery goals for learning. And I will leave it there. And I hope you all have a wonderful week, and that hopefully in some small way I've generated a condition that will motivate you to want to learn more about educational psychology.